لا معنا احنا كجروب لا، حضر معنا الجروب الكبير، احنا بس حضرنا افتتاح معنا وبعدين طلعنا ورحنا الجروب حقنا في وقت منفصل. أول شيء كل جهة تنجز الحالة. أول شيء كل لازم وبعدين احنا نبغى يعني من جروب ميتينجز نطلع في أشياء معينة وأكشنز كان created.
We'll resume our program. The next presentation by Bahrain.
كان والله طويل يعني. Very good كان. جزء.
Thank you. A couple of comments on the topic. Even though maybe it's not, I would say, as sexy as some of the other topics, I think it's relevant. A lot of the regulators, once they mature, they will start looking at anti-competition more seriously. I know we have a combination of basically some of the large players like Indonesia, some of the smaller players in Indonesia. So I think a lot of the information that I will walk through is relevant to both. Some of them you want to lobby against and preempt in terms of competition guidelines. Some others actually, as a challenger, you might want to actually opt for and try to push the regulation regulator for favorable regulation. What I'll do is through the presentation, I'll walk you through the history also so that you understand how the case was built. I will try to share with you also a lot of the thinking behind of the responses and how we try to lobby for it. Because what we felt a very valuable lesson learned is actually the thinking process of how to tackle anti-competition. And at least on our side of the world, in the GCC and in the Middle East, there is really no precedence for anti-competition. I think the Bahrain regulator was the first to actually pursue a serious, a public at least, investigation. I know Saudi had some, but they're usually hush-hush and behind doors, so nobody knows the outcome, nobody understands the process or the rationale behind the thinking. So I'll be walking you through that also. Some history. When we've launched, and we've launched in March 2010, market was around 122% penetration, predominantly an expat, I would say 50% expat community within Bahrain, so population 50-50. This is important because later on we'll be focusing on the international voice market. That's where the investigation is happening. Predominantly against prepaid, quite unique environment in Bahrain is actually quite competitive. So beyond 3 mobile operators, you have 2 WiMAX, you have around 13 prepaid calling card companies. So they use our mobile network to originate and call 800 in order to make international IDD calls, and also a lot of ISPs. So the market, especially considering the size, is extremely competitive. In terms of evolution from 2000 to 2008 to 2009, there was actually a dip in the revenues of the market. So the market had stagnated to a certain degree. Our launch was based on very aggressive campaigns. So from day one, we knew that if we wanted to be relevant in the market, we had to go in big and we had to try to capture as many gross as during the first couple of years. So at this point, we are the #1 operator, #1 in mobile market share, subscriber market share, #1 in mobile broadband market share, and we were able to do it in less than 2 years. So our campaign was big on a heavy focus on international discounts. Nevertheless, what people don't realize is actually competition responded. Immediately after we've launched, a couple of weeks later, Batelco responded with a similar offer. Batelco is the incumbent. And Zain also responded with a similar offer, however, below the line. So we need to follow also, I think it's going to be relevant. Let's discuss it in the next slide. Let me give you some context also further on the market. So growth, what you can see is actually the market, even though there's a price reduction, the market actually grew in terms of minutes. Zone 2 is the zone that we're being investigated on. International for us is 4 different markets, 4 zones, GCC, Asia Pacific, so this is equivalent almost to Asia Pacific zone, that's a specific zone, that's why we're zooming a bit on it. And revenues overall decreased over the period, even though the minutes have increased. So there has been growth in the minutes after we've entered, however, in line with the decrease in the market prior that we've seen, there was a value reduction in international. This came though at an expense. It came at the expense of the prepaid calling card companies, so they were not happy. When they've seen 63% of their share of the whole market, as their market share, that got reduced by the end of 2010 to around 40%. So obviously they were not too excited about our entry. So what they did is they went to the TRA and they filed an anti-competition investigation. Their anti-competition investigation was basically predatory pricing, margin squeeze. Accordingly, the TRA officially notified us in November that they're initiating an anti-competition complaint for abuse of dominant position, allegedly margin squeeze, predatory pricing, so two anti-competitive practices. And they identified the relevant market as retail market for mobile originated internationally. The way they basically, the legal basis for this, our telecom law has explicitly that they have to prevent and restrict, we cannot prevent or restrict or distort competition, as well as our license also clearly say that we're prohibited from abusing our dominant position.
Is TRA the competition authority or NMA?
That's the anti-competition, that's the regulator. We don't have an anti-competition authority. They are the same authority. No, we have zero, we have no dominance in any market, not even on termination on our own network. And I'll talk about that actually remember this is November 2010, so that's almost 6 months after we launched. So they received the complaint a couple of months even before that. So that was almost immediately after we launched.
The complaint was against Viva?
No, to the TRA. So
yes, so against whom?
Against Viva. Yes. Against Viva. Actually, Viva and Better, to be specific. And I'll talk more about Better for sure.
So is it, the alleged claim is only Viva Bahrain for dominant position or jointly?
They said, well, no, they've actually filed 2 different complaints. They said Viva is abusing its dominant position and it's performing the predatory pricing on a margin squeeze. Now, some sideline and some background information. We've been, I think, sharing notes that the regulator is quite sophisticated. As part of the framework, of the regulatory framework, we have competition guidelines. So that clearly outlines what you can, what you cannot do, how they will measure that, how they can fine you to a certain degree. And in that they discuss ex-ante regulation, which we're all familiar with, any S&P designation per se. But also they outline the process for ex-post investigation, which is that we all know that this is the trend in regulation. You want to be light on ex-ante and you want to be harsh on ex-post, but I think that they've detailed it to a very granular level. So our competition guideline, and this is important, I think, for the people that are going through such a process, it's a good reading material to understand a bit how they've outlined cost, the different cost benchmarks that are being discussed. So this document, the competition guideline, has very, very valuable insights. Now, from our perspective, some key lessons learned is, even though you don't have designation in S&P, from an ex-ante perspective, if there is no S&P designation, they can still perform an ex-post anti-competition evaluation. One hard lesson learned is this market doesn't have to be like this market. So even though they define certain markets in an ex-ante market review, in our case, as I'll discuss later on, they've actually defined a new market, which was actually something we had not prepared for, because when you are responding, typically you go back to the things that you know about that market, right? You go to the market definition, to the market review, and accordingly you respond. So I'll be sharing some comments also about that. But predominantly, again, these markets do not have to be these markets, and you have to be careful that the lack of dominance ex-ante perspective does not prevent the TRA to go after you from an export, and I think this is important for Malaysia specifically. So another thing from our competition guidelines, I'll be talking more about this, but I just want to introduce them so that everyone is familiar with the terminology. When the TRA wants to evaluate whether you've acted anti-competitively, they have to look at your cost, or they have to look at cost. And for them, they define two cost benchmarks. One is equally efficient. That's your own cost, the own operator cost. So in this case, if there's an investigation against Viva, it would be Viva cost. And the other benchmark is usually reasonably efficient, and that's basically an efficient operator. So typically, the authority has a choice between using either the operator own cost and a reasonably efficient cost. Of course, each of them has an advantage depending if you're trying to defend against the case, or you're actually attacking someone, or it depends if you are an incumbent with high cost, or if you're a challenger with low cost. So we'll be talking a bit more about those, but again, the two things about the competition guidelines, that's what I wanted to summarize to you as context before I go into
So what's the difference? Is it percentage-wise?
The difference is if they decide to use an equally efficient operator in their cost benchmark, they'll take your costs as is. So let's say STC submits or Kuwait submits their cost, that's the cost measure they take. Versus if they decide to take reasonably efficient, they will benchmark an efficient operator. Let's say they say their marketing cost is 15%, and they will use 15% as a benchmark rather than.
If I get the, exaggerated number.
And that's where it's important. You have to understand your cost to know what to lobby for, because it depends if you are defending, if you are raising a complaint against someone who has high cost, you want them to go for equally efficient because you want to illustrate that operator costs are actually really high, and he's basically acting anti-competitive. So this is again.
Then it becomes
either predatory or a margin squeeze, depending on the longer term approach. Let me go back then to the case. So again, our initial response, they came back to us with an investigation in the retail market for international originating calls. So we said the obvious: new entrant cannot be dominant in any retail market. Right? So there is no SMP and there is no dominance, there is no designation. So how can we be acting anti-competitive? Plus, we've done something which was quite unique. Even on day one when we've launched, we've offered the prepaid calling card companies the choice, and we sold them origination service. So we've actually offered an input to the service, and we have not acted anti-competitive. In fact, during our promotion, we've actually offered it cheaper than competition. So we've told them all of that. And another thing we've defended, because one of the things that the TRA always tries to prove is consumer welfare is affected. Remember, at the end, the objective of the TRA is to basically promote competition and promote consumer welfare. So these are the two overarching objectives. So we said we've offered cheaper rates. Cheaper rates are offered by our competitors, so there's really no harm. PPCs did benefit from our entry, so the prepaid calling card companies, when they've entered, they've used our service and they have access to our customers. In fact, the whole market, the volume of minutes increased. And finally, other OLOs have benefited from our entry. So again, due to their termination and how they're using our network. TRA then came back to us almost a year later, so this is almost 2 years, and again, timing is important. I want you to appreciate also for your sake how long these things take, because it's important, because if you decide to go on such an action, don't bet on an immediate response unless it happens to you what happened to Baterco. Now maybe it's a good side note to talk about this actually here. So Baterco, I mentioned, actually I don't have the slide on them, but the same complaint was raised against them. Unfortunately for them, they got served with an emergency order to withdraw the service. This was predominantly because they had SMP designation in the wholesale market for coal conveyance. So they had a cost for international wholesale coal conveyance, and they had submitted accounting separation earlier, and the TRA could quickly look at the cost and see if there is a margin squeeze. So immediately what the TRA did, actually set the price floor to better. They will still be investigated, so there is still the same investigation ongoing, but from a retail competitiveness perspective, Batelco was out of the picture for a short time. Not for a short time, was out of the picture. So this is important, and I think it's very important that you are well aware of what you've shared, how you've shared, and again, if there is any bottleneck in any of the markets that are being investigated, because your competitor might have, or a challenger might have an advantage. And I think, again, this might be relevant to some of the markets that you are facing. So they got served, and there's still an investigation. I'll talk more about Batelco and some of the lessons learned towards the end. But what they came back to us was actually quite surprising. We did not expect it. So they came back with dominance in a different market. So originally the investigation started in retail market, and we were preparing, responding, and suddenly they came back to us. They said, "You're dominant in wholesale free-form origination on your own network." So this is again the 800 service that a calling card. So I buy a calling card. I use your Viva's mobile service to call an international destination. I enter my PIN, etc. That's the type of service they are describing. And they said predominantly this is, and I'm summarizing it here in my own word, as this is similar to termination. Because you have natural dominance in termination, you are dominant also on your own network for free-form origination, which is partially flawed, and I'll talk about it later on. They said also they dropped the focus on predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is hard to prove. Predatory pricing means you're going to decrease the price to drive competition out and then increase your prices back again. So it's a harder one to prove relative to margin squeeze. So what they said basically you've acted anti-competitively but predominantly on margin squeeze. They said an equally efficient operator supplying PPCs, so supplying the prepaid calling card services, would not have been able to compete with Viva Retail. So if they bought from us free-form origination, which is a bottleneck input that they've identified and they said we are dominant in, they said they cannot compete with our prices. And then finally they wanted to fine us. And I'll talk more about the fine later on. So in thinking of the response, we had a lot of angles to go after. So we said, okay, should we focus predominantly on the dominance angle? Should we look predominantly on the costing? Should we go predominantly on the administrative side? We debated this a lot internally because at the end, if you lose one, we don't want to lose the whole case. And this is in contrast. So at the end, what we decided to is we decided to go after all angles. We felt we have valid reasons across all of them, and if even we don't win it, which we believe that we've been advised that we have a good chance, at least we minimize the fine, and at least we try. Unlike Batelco couldn't couldn't go after all of them because one, they had submitted their cost. It was the numbers were clearly there is some type of margin squeeze. Now what degree is different. So they had to go with one approach versus others. So again, we'll talk maybe about lessons learned, but again, the approach has to be consistent with the historical data that you supplied and the previous positions you've adapted. So I'll talk a bit about them. So administratively, we said, wait, you just told us that you're investigating us in retail, and now you switch market on us, which is unfair and unreasonable. You can't start an investigation in market and open it in another. Now, the telecom law does not prohibit them from doing that, but it doesn't explicitly give them the right to switch markets. So this is an important lobbying exercise. If you are lobbying for adjustment to the telecom law or any competition guidelines, you want to make sure they don't grant themselves authority to switch markets on you. And we said also, again, from a regulatory policy perspective, this doesn't make sense. A new entrant being investigated for dominance. That just basically, back to the, I think, promoting investments. It's counterproductive. Second thing, we talked about the market identification. Wholesale free-form origination on your own network is a unique market. We know Jordan has it, but that was a political decision, but the EU doesn't have it. None of the Europe countries have it. They didn't define it in their market review and the ex-ante, so that market is counter. We don't know where that market actually came from. So again, we're not familiar with that. Also, even if you want to say there is a market like that, again, we don't believe we are dominant in that market because fundamentally, the TRA is asking the wrong question. Termination is not origination because in origination, a PPC company can go to other mobile operators and buy the service versus termination. So fundamentally, we cannot, even if we're dominant in termination, which we were not at that point, and we are not even today, it cannot imply dominance in free-form origination, so we had an issue with the dominance, and I'll talk a bit more about these later on. And finally, we decided to duplicate the margin squeeze. We thought, okay, considering we had not submitted a lot of information to the TRA, we're quite selective on how we submit information. They might have calculated stuff wrong or used the wrong assumptions. So we went after, and we spent a lot of effort on costing because these are gray matters. Usually the issue we have, and that's the message I tell Alayyan, our CEO, all the time, the problem with regulation is gray. I'll convince you, but again, it's not factual, right? So we tried, even considering that we might lose these, we tried to base as much as possible on actual costing benchmarks and actual costing, and to show that their costing has been wrong because they don't have the right level of information.
Sorry,
Yes.
the purpose for the terminating and originating from the PPC.
Yes.
PPC buy the bulk traffic from you and
They-
using your access.
No, they buy an 800 number. They use basically, let's say they buy an 800 number from Viva.
Yeah, and with your access code.
With our access code, their customer calls, he buys the prepaid calling card company, use my mobile, calls the 800 number, puts his PIN, and makes an international.
Carrier pre-selection.
It's like a carrier, pre-selection. But with a, you have to buy actually a calling card.
Yeah, I think you are the one who make the
It's on mobile. It's a carrier selection on mobile.
So you are the one who make the call or get the call from.
We originate the code from us to basically wherever they want us to take it. Yeah. So on margin squeeze, again, we've duplicated the analysis for both reasonably efficient, so we got benchmarks from an efficient operator, as well as our own cost. And we told them that, again, we believe that our own cost is not appropriate.
What was it?
Sorry?
What was it?
Our own. Equally efficient is our own costs, as Viva, basically. They're not appropriate cost measures to be used in this case. Because as a startup, we're not efficient. So again, you cannot take an inefficient operation and benchmark it. I'll talk more about this also later on. And we told them again, the fine that you are imposing is disproportionate. It doesn't make sense to find someone that has just launched, and when you launch, you cannot be aware of your forward-looking cost, simply because we have no obligations to look at cost. There's no ex-ante regulations. A bit more on those. So on dominance, again, abuse to a new entrant, again, less than a year, again, is unfair, unprecedented. We haven't heard of anything like that. 140% penetration, which means that PPCs have alternatives in the market. So if you have dual SIM, right, and you are a prepaid calling card company, you could still actually sell your service to everyone else. So how can we have a dominance position in that market? And we told them that basically the question they're fundamentally asking is a wrong question. The real question is, can the prepaid calling card nourish or buy the service not from Viva network, but from a given network? And hence the market should be the total free-form origination, and hence Viva cannot be dominant. Viva market share in mobile on retail. So in the retail side, we had by October around market share of 25%. So we told them even from a retail perspective, we were not dominant. So again, how can we be dominant in a wholesale, from a wholesale perspective? No other factors for other dominance. We do have, by the way, detail, not too detailed, but we have two measures for dominance. 40% subscriber share in retail, 40% volume share, revenue share in wholesale. They've defined it loosely in the competition guidelines. They said these are the rough guidelines, rough measures, and we will still do a monopoly test and some other tests, and these are rough guidelines. So we told them again, 25% is far from what you've defined in your competition guidelines. Again, firm turnover relative to the size of the market, whether it controls means to access, basically we don't. So again, how can we be dominant? Finally, at the point that was raised, you just confirmed to us in July that we have no S&P dominance in anything. So again, you're surprising us, you're just changing basically tactics for us. Margin squeeze. So margin squeeze is basically you squeeze your retail price, so your retail price decrease. So basically someone cannot generate profit. So the definition is retail minus wholesale does not cover your downstream plus competitive returns. Competitive returns is a tough one. Usually regulators use WACC. In our case, they don't have an estimate of the WACC, so most likely they use a benchmark for WACC, which is typically 9 to 11%. But they said basically you decreased your retail price where you cannot generate a hell of a profit. So on the costing side, so a critical question that we try to present in our case to them is, okay, what is cost? Right? Whose cost are you looking at? And is that cost efficient? Ultimately, whenever the TRA wants to use any cost, they have to prove that it's actually an efficient cost. Because if an operator is inefficient, then you cannot say that they cannot make a profit. They cannot make a profit because they are inefficient. So the most critical measure is one to talk about efficiency. And what we try to outline in our case, because the TRA had used our costs, which obviously we just launched, we had a huge marketing campaign with minimal number of customers. If you look at that as in terms of percentages, they'll be through the roof. So we told them you have inappropriately used our own cost in this case. That basically you overestimated our incremental retail costs, and you have not looked at the incremental cost to do business, rather you've looked at the full retail costs, and you have not properly allocated proportionally to the revenue that we are talking about. So we identified some gaps in their cost allocation method. By the way, when they serve us the notice, they give us a lot of detailed information. It's not like they just say, you're acting anti-competitively. They actually give us detailed Excel sheets on how they've done this. What we said is, again, our termination costs are not efficient. Look at more efficient operators, and we got some costing benchmarks from Tata, VT, you name it. The cheapest price per destination, we told them, look at best practices on how to get VoIP and cheap rate termination costs, because in the end, that's termination a very important part of the service. We told them our scale is suboptimal, so don't look at our scale. Let's benchmark retail. Or let's use our forward-looking. By the time we got the response, it was Q3 2011. So we told them, don't take our cost structure when we've launched. If you want to benchmark an efficient operator, look at our recent audited statements, and let's look at marketing as a percentage of spend. So this is a proxy for an efficient, relative efficient operator. So again, we try to defend on the costing side. And finally, on fining, again, we told them that the TRA has defined some fining, the seriousness, economic impact of the size of the relevant fine, duration. They did give us a discount on the fine, 50%, because they said we're not aware of the cost, but we said nevertheless, there is no consumer harm. You have not proven consumer harm. The fine is again based, there is a procedural error in this. You switched hats on us, and again, you cannot fine us. It's a misguided market. No competitive effects, so there's no analysis whether competition got harmed even. And we cannot be aware of forward-looking costs. So basically, we launched in 2010. We don't have any idea of our costs. We don't have historical data. So how can you fine us for something we are unaware of?
How much was the fine?
The fine was around, after discount, around $2.5 million.
Oh, so there's a discount.
50% discount. Actually, this is an important point. We got a mitigation, and this is when I was talking to some of you, the personal relationships help. So we have a very good relationship with the TRA. Unlike the telco, which doesn't, the telco actually had an aggravation factor. So their fine got multiplied by 2. So the telco's fine is around 4 million dinars, so you're talking about $10 million.
Is there a ceiling
The 15% of the market of the relevant market revenues is what's defined in the telecom. The telecom law, unfortunately, doesn't have.
It's normally 2%.
Yeah, in our sake, the telecom law defines it as a high ceiling.
In the competition.
It is potentially high. Just quickly, let me go over some of the lessons learned, and let's start with the investigation itself, and then I'll talk about also what that taught us, if you want, as an organization or as a sector. One, we did a tactic, we decided on a tactic around mid of this year. We said, okay, there is us and there is Batelco into the investigation. Now, we don't want the TRA to just have a Viva issue and a Batelco issue. Why don't we complain against them? Let's make this a sector issue. Because a sector issue for them politically is harder, and it just also complicates everybody's life. If I will be impacted in any ways, I might as well just open it up on my competition. So we actually complained against them. So we launched an anti-competition investigation against them, and they're being investigated on the same issue as us. So now there, Batelco and Viva are being investigated for anti-competitive behavior. They were not too happy, I can tell you, even though we have a very healthy relationship with them and Batelco, they were not too happy, but I did call them before I sent it there. Just to be nice. Better understanding of the competition guidelines. Unfortunately, a lot of us are not trained economists. These are complicated to understand. It's typically, the subtle change in words mean different things. And again, it took us internally a long time to appreciate and understand the complexity of what is meant by the different. So what is an EOA? How does it get translated? And what are costs? How are costs treated? Which leads me to the next one, is hire an economist. And in our case, preferably if someone actually wrote the competition guidelines. We actually hired someone that wrote the competition guidelines for Bahrain. So the TRA was not too happy when they realized we used the same economist, but we told them, hey, it's pays more. So you definitely need help. You definitely need help in fine-tuning the response. Even though we do understand regulation, I think these guys add a lot of value to the discussion. Even when you're thinking of the strategy and all of that, at least now we're using economists more often than we should. Hire, again, lawyers. Obviously, this is a serious matter. It sets precedents, so try to find lawyers that have experience in anti-competition in telecom, which is not too common. You'll find, again, anti-competition in cranberry farms and a lot of topics, but again, try to identify specifically the lawyer that will work with you that is good. We spent a long time just trying to find someone that can help us with this matter. Make sure you're consistent with the response. So the reason why Batelco got an aggravation factor is they actually sent information that is inconsistent with what they sent earlier. Now, and this is important, especially to the incumbents in the room, because